In the 1950s, India and China were two massive, newly independent Asian nations trying to figure out how to coexist. Diplomatic relations were built on pure optimism. In India, there was a popular catchphrase, Hindi Chini bye bye, which literally translates to Indians and Chinese are brothers. But that brotherhood ignored a massive frozen problem. The borders separating them hadn't been drawn by the modern governments in New Delhi or Beijing. They were drawn by old, fallen empires, and China completely refused to recognize them. This map shows exactly where those geographic ticking time bombs were located. In the eastern sector, there was the McMahon Line, which India claimed as legal, but China rejected. And in the western sector, there was the barren, high-altitude desert of Aksai Chin. India operated on the assumption that this diplomatic goodwill was a permanent shield, leaving the physical border largely unmonitored while the neighboring military presence was growing. The first crack in the relationship happened in 1950. China annexed Tibet, swallowing a massive buffer state, and suddenly bringing the Chinese military directly to India's northern doorstep. Tensions severely escalated in 1959 when India granted asylum to the Dalai Lama, the Tibetan spiritual leader who had fled Chinese rule. Beijing viewed this as a direct insult. To assert its border claims, India initiated what it called the forward policy in 1961. The military was ordered to push patrols outward and set up outposts deep inside the disputed territories. But these forward outposts were agonizingly weak. Small units of soldiers were dropped into freezing, high-altitude terrain without heavy weapons, proper supply lines, or basic winter logistics. India was projecting an aggressive border presence, but lacked the infrastructure to actually defend it. They were walking straight into a trap. That trap snapped shut on October 20th, 1962. Chinese troops launched a massive, highly coordinated surprise offensive, and the timing was no accident. While Chinese forces poured over the Himalayas, the United States and the Soviet Union were entirely distracted, locked in a nuclear standoff during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The tactical map reveals the operation's sheer scale. Coordinated attacks struck the eastern Nifa region, modern-day Arunachal Pradesh, and western Ladakh simultaneously. The numerical disparity was staggering. China committed over 80,000 troops, while India had roughly 20,000 isolated soldiers. The invaders were also backed by heavy logistics, relying on newly constructed supply lines and roads that China had quietly built through Tibet. The coordination and scale of the attack indicated months of planning for a decisive military blow. Up in the Himalayas, combat is dictated by geography. Soldiers had to fight through freezing temperatures, suffocatingly low oxygen, and jagged, unforgiving terrain. Indian troops simply weren't prepared for high-altitude combat. They fought fiercely, but they were doing it in summer uniforms, without adequate snow gear or coordinated artillery support. The defensive lines rapidly collapsed. Entire units were overrun, taking heavy casualties in disasters like the Battle of Nam Khachu in the east. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the fighting stopped. Having achieved their tactical goals, China declared a unilateral ceasefire on November 21st. This map illustrates the final outcome of that brief war. Chinese forces withdrew from their newly captured ground in the east, but in the west, they retained total control over the strategic Aksai Chin region. The Himalayas weaponized logistics. The conflict proved that raw bravery from soldiers cannot survive a complete vacuum of infrastructure and planning. Back in New Delhi, the defeat triggered a profound psychological shock. The post-colonial innocence was dead, and the idealistic belief in regional brotherhood was shattered. The public demanded accountability. The immediate political fallout forced Defense Minister V.K. Krishna Menon to resign in disgrace. The defeat forced a realization that diplomatic standing was worthless without the ability to hold ground in the mountains. In response, the government initiated a massive restructuring of the Indian Army. They modernized defense capabilities, urgently constructing advanced road networks right up to the border. The trauma of the defeat also forced India to reconsider its strict policy of non-alignment. To ensure its survival, New Delhi began pivoting towards strategic military cooperation with both the Soviet Union and Western powers. This topographical view highlights the most visible scar of the 1962 conflict, the line of actual control. This jagged, heavily guarded boundary still separates the two nations today. The fighting may have officially ended decades ago, but militarization of these high-altitude peaks never did. Both sides have spent the last 60 years digging in. You can draw a direct line from the 1962 war to modern headlines, like the brutal and deadly hand-to-hand clashes in the Galwan Valley in 2020. Up here, the exact same metrics dictate survival. Infrastructure, deep logistics, and specialized troop readiness are just as critical now as they were during the initial invasion. A month of fighting turned a porous frontier into a permanent military front, locking two nuclear powers into a high-altitude stalemate that hasn't broken in over 60 years.